All right, so as we get kind of closer to spring break, which is right before spring break, we'll have that first and only midterm. I'll be getting some practice exams up before we start class Thursday. So I'll probably sometime tomorrow afternoon. I've got a couple meetings that'll keep me a little busier, but I should be able to get those together and get those up sometime tomorrow, but for sure before we start class on Thursday. I'll also be putting up an online quiz after class today that'll be due before we start class Thursday as well as the reading that we'll kind of go over on Thursday. Okay. So we also have that homework, which is due at the end of the day Thursday. So if you want to turn that in class, you can turn in a hard copy or kind of upload your files to Canvas. Either way, that's, I'm okay with either one. Okay. So any questions from me before we kind of jump into things here? So one thing that we did at the end of last class, I kind of show you how to use Google Scholar a little bit. So I'll start referencing quite a few more articles, and then kind of think about, how whatever the topic is we're talking about, how it's supported by these various articles, kind of thinking about similar to yours. You're going to try to find various articles that support or that are related to whatever topic you have. So we left off kind of thinking about teams like building new facilities, right? Or renovating old ones. So, we said why, we see these costs, right? I think I showed you these last class, right? We've got some obscene costs here. We talked about potentially splitting those costs, NBA, NHL teams, kind of using the same facility, right? These are, enormous costs. So it must be that teams believe that they're going to see an increase in their revenue, right? Otherwise, I guess they just want bragging rights, right? So we're thinking about this from a profit motivation. It should be that the revenues are greater than the additional costs. Okay. So we talked about, maybe we see this initial boost based off some of the findings that initially we might see an increase in attendance, ticket prices, potentially revenue, but the studies that are out there really kind of only find this honeymoon effect. It's only in the initial couple years. Right? So it must be that additional revenue, even in those first few years, is enough to kind of compensate for the additional costs, right? Or that potentially, some of these studies, it's kind of difficult to, the further out you go, there's more factors that kind of muddy the water, so to speak. And so maybe there are, additional revenues after the first few years, but, if things like the quality of the team changes, things like that, that's going to mask that. However, the actions that we see of teams building these new stadiums, they must believe that these revenues are greater than the costs. Right? So some teams don't really see a much of a boost in attendance. If that's the measure that we're going to use as kind of, was there increased fan interest after this new stadium was built? If we're just looking at attendance measures, why might a boost in attendance, right? If we don't see that, why might it still be beneficial to build these new facilities? Even if I keep selling the same number of tickets, think about maybe teams that are selling at capacity. So if I've got the ticket market, anytime I think of the ticket market, I should be thinking about my quantity of tickets here. I've got my price. I should always be thinking about, right, stadium capacity being this vertical line. So really, my supply curve or my marginal cost runs along the x-axis and then is vertical at whatever capacity is. So let's say this was my old stadium, right? And we'll even kind of build in some monopoly power. So here's the marginal revenue. And we'll assume that we had, high enough to where the quantity sold, and we go up to the demand curve to figure out what price we could charge. Right? So if I was currently selling my stadium out, what is an increase in demand? Let's say I build a new facility. And even for right now, we'll just even assume that the facility is the exact same size. Maybe this isn't even a new facility. Maybe we're just completely renovating the one we had. So the Yankees did this to their stadium not too far in the distant past. So the same, maybe if we even keep the capacity the same, if I see an increase in demand, right? Let's assume that new facility is increasing interest in the team, increasing the experience of people attending the game. So it increases my demand and marginal revenue. Marginal revenue hits marginal cost. I would keep selling the same number of tickets, but at this new facility, that equilibrium price is quite a bit higher. Okay? So if I think about, and this is, someone asked me the other day about formula sheets. So we really don't have too many complicated formulas. Now, there will be a couple things you have to kind of recall. One of the major ones is if we're thinking about total revenue, if we're just thinking about the ticket market, total revenue is simply going to be the price that I can charge multiplied by the quantity I'm selling. The quantity we were selling stays the same. The price was higher, so we know that total revenue would be higher after building this new facility. Now, I'm drawing a situation where we were meeting capacity before. We didn't change the capacity of the new facility. All we're thinking about is the effect of that demand increase from that new facility. So even if, maybe capacity goes a little bit lower, maybe capacity goes up. In fact, it could be that maybe my new facility has a slightly lower capacity, right? And so maybe I see, we'll call this, I don't know. I'll call this Q3, just since we already have 1 and 2 here. Even after you build that new facility, right, you can kind of see the price, we'll call this P3, will be even higher than it was before. So maybe even when I build that new facility, I see this huge demand increase, but my new capacity was a little bit smaller. Well, that's okay, because even though quantity went down, the price is going up even more than it would have if I didn't kind of reduce the capacity. So depending on where I'm at on my demand curve, whether or not it's elastic, right, whether that price change was greater than that quantity response change to that increase in price, potentially I could still see total revenues go up, even having a smaller capacity stadium. And if we look at some of the numbers, some of the new facilities actually have fewer numbers of seats or tickets available than the old ones. So why might that be? Well, if they believe they're operating at a point in the demand curve, right, where the quantity response isn't going to be as responsive to those price changes. So we'd say we're on the inelastic portions, and we don't have to, we're not diving too much into elasticities here, but the idea would be that that increase in price might not be kind of met with as much of a reduction in quantity, depending where we're at in the demand and the size of the demand shift, obviously. So we'd actually have to have some equations to kind of really work out these numbers. Demand's not linear in practice, so we're going to have a little bit harder and more difficult math here, but the same principles, general idea would apply. Right? I could reduce my stadium's capacity, and if that increase in my demand curve was great enough, I can actually sell fewer tickets at a higher price and actually increase revenue, because the price drives revenue up, and that reduction in tickets would drive it down just a little bit. But if the price increase was enough to compensate for that, we could still see total revenue go up. Here we're thinking about really what's the additional revenue, and then just compare that to the cost of that new facility. Right? So that's why we might not see a boost in attendance, right? Also, we've got other factors. I kind of mentioned this earlier. Things like the quality of the team might not change, right? So even if I build a new stadium, if my team, right, doesn't perform better, I may still continue to see low attendance, right? The demand curve is not just impacted by having this new stadium, but it's also impacted by some of these other qualities, or these other factors, I should say. Right? So one thing that could be, even if I ran a regression here, and like I had some variable that recorded whether or not it was a year after a new facility was built, maybe I still see that that's negative, even if having that new facility actually helped boost demand. Because if the teams that are all deciding to build new facilities are all my low quality teams, well, then the new facility is going to be highly correlated with being low quality, and it's going to look like building that new stadium was decreasing demand, when in fact it was just that all the teams building new facilities were lower quality. So I might have what we call kind of some selection issues there, in that if all my low quality teams are the one building new facilities, well, of course it's going to look like my new facilities are having a negative impact on attendance. Right? And I can, investigate this if I have the data. I can kind of look and see, okay, the teams that are building these new facilities, what's their rank in the league, or are they how many of them are in the playoffs, things along those lines. But it would be something that we need to consider, right? Kind of what was the performance, or what was the characteristics of the teams prior to the new facility being built. So, like I said, I forget what year it was now. Do I have it here? No. So some year, I don't know, I think it was in the last decade, the Yankees renovated their stadium, and it cost like just as much as a new stadium was, right? $1.1 billion. Okay. I can't remember the whole story here. There was something about like the projection was maybe like a little bit more than half this. So like they're way over budget, but regardless, right, you have this huge amount spent on these renovations, and New York actually saw attendance decline. Well, we already mentioned that's okay, right? Even if attendance was lower, right, as long as it was compensated for by more than, a greater increase in the price of the tickets, then that's okay. We could still see total revenue go up, which is what happened in the case of the New York Yankees, right? So they saw attendance go down, but they saw total revenues from gate revenue or ticket revenue go up, right? And this is the idea that even though, you could see a quantity stay the same or even be reduced a little bit if the capacity is smaller, those price increases can compensate for that, okay? We've already talked about this. So we've got kind of ticket prices here. So I think I used this in the first homework, I believe, but when the Braves kind of built their new stadium, they actually didn't build kind of as large a capacity, so they had a lower capacity in the new stadium. So maybe even if we're looking at just attendance, there's no way they could actually increase attendance, right, if they have a smaller capacity. So it kind of jumped the gun a little bit on that one, but that's kind of what this is referencing, kind of me drawing where if we saw that new capacity be a little bit lower. Okay? What also might be true is this lower attendance, right? We talk about, well, I've been talking about tickets as though it's like they're all the same, right? But if you're going to a game, right, if you go like on StubHub or wherever you're going to look for tickets, what's going to be true about the tickets that you see, the prices that you see? They vary depending on what? All right, if they're courtside tickets, or I'm right on the 50-yard line, whatever it is, whatever the general preference of consumers is, different seats are going to have different values. So really, when we're thinking about this ticket market, we should actually be a little bit more specific in that when I'm using this vertical line for capacity, I would actually have like several different markets. So maybe I would have a ticket market where I'm trying to find kind of an equilibrium price for seats just in this section. And then I have another ticket market for seats just in this other section, right? Because the characteristics are different. The angle of which I can view the field, how far away from the field I am. And so it's almost like we've got capacities of different types, right? How many seats do I have in section 103 versus how many seats do I have in section 204, right? My capacities probably won't be the stadium capacity, but it will be the capacity of that type of tickets. Right? And so what's one type of ticket that I think I can probably charge a much higher price for? Well, a lot of these, especially all the new stadiums, all have luxury suites or luxury boxes, however you want. There's different terminology for them, but basically, right, I'm taking a pretty good, I'm taking a area where if I was just trying to cram seats into there, I could get way more people in, right? I'm reducing the capacity in those luxury suites and at least in the physical area, because I know that I can create a different experience, that certain consumers will be willing to pay a much, much higher price to be in that luxury box as opposed to just in general seating. Right? So we look at a lot of these new facilities, we see if we look at the ratio of like the number of tickets that are luxury boxes or club seats or these kind of special seating areas, it's been going up over time, right? So they've realized this, they're building more and more of these kind of seats which they can command a higher price for. Right? So I think if you just look at the NFL, and this is like not an exhaustive list, but just kind of choosing some, you kind of see, this was like pretty unheard of at the time in 72 to have 80 luxury boxes or suites. And then the number has kind of increased over time. You'll notice like in some of the newer stadiums, they've actually started to differentiate their product set even more. So it's not just one type of specialized seating. So they actually had fewer suites, but a lot more of what they call these club seats. Right? So they're just identifying there's different consumer bases, right? And there's different quantity of each, right? There's only a certain number of people who can afford to be in like a season ticket holder of a luxury box, right? But maybe there's a lot more people, right? A higher number of consumers would increase that demand curve where they have the ability and willingness to pay for club seats, but maybe not for luxury suites or luxury boxes. Okay? So we really see teams start to play around with creating different products we talked about before. Like the NFL creates different types of products, right? Thursday night games, they sell off, they sell off the rights to Monday night games to someone else. Same idea here. It's just instead of the broadcast rights, they're creating new products with their tickets. What would be, I always thought a really good way to get at this is, I'm thinking specifically football here. This probably wouldn't apply, although there's probably something you could do with basketball. What's maybe the difference if I think about a college basketball or football team or stadium relative to a professional? I mean, a lot of these college stadiums, it's not like they have multiple levels, like a lot of these NFL stadiums do. If you think about the NBA, they've got multiple levels. A lot of college stadiums are just stadium seating up to wherever it stops. And so I've never seen anyone do this, but you probably could look at the differences between the NFL and college and kind of see like potentially how much money is lost at these college stadiums if they started to kind of renovate their stadiums to have these specialized type of seats, which a lot of them actually started doing, right? So they do have some luxury boxes and luxury suites, usually like up where the announcers are and things like that. But right, they could do a lot more, right? If we kind of compare them to NFL stadiums. We're also going to think about, you've seen a lot of teams, even at the college level, they'll do like in basketball, they'll do specialized seating closer to the court, right? And all they're really trying to do is create a product that's a little bit higher quality, which they know demand will be higher for, which they know they can then command a higher price for those tickets. So that's kind of the direction that we see teams moving in. We can also think about what would be the benefits to fans, right? So, it's hard to really estimate that, right? There's going to be utility gains to fans in several ways, right? It's just a more enjoyable experience, right? Maybe the food that they sell, I don't know, concessions are better, things along those lines. So, kind of go down here. So I have all these up here. What are some other things that I've forgotten? Maybe like the old stadiums. I remember, I think it was Detroit Stadium. There's like a flagpole in like in the outfield, so that there was a certain section where like if you got the wrong seat, you basically couldn't see half the game because you got a flag, this huge utility pole in front of you. So they've cleaned up some of that kind of thing, and adding a lot of amenities. So I think it's Arizona has a pool out in right field, and you've seen a lot of these kind of like beer garden areas pop up even at the collegiate level. And so they're trying to basically increase the quality, once again, increase demand, command higher ticket prices. Okay. And all these are benefits to fans, right? All of these would help increase not necessarily consumer surplus, but they would help increase the marginal benefit of all consumers, right? So potentially, even though their marginal benefit is going up, maybe we see a loss in consumer surplus, right? If these teams are able to better identify consumers, we kind of talked about this idea of price discrimination, potentially that they can extract some of that consumer surplus. So even though marginal benefit is higher, consumer surplus could potentially be lower. I'll kind of give you, since we had this graph earlier, and actually I'll draw another one because there's a lot going on. So let's just do let's think about just in the ticket market, how could, consumer surplus actually go down? So let's say, here's my supply curve or my capacity. We've got my marginal revenue, my old stadium, demand from the old stadium. Now we see this kind of higher demand curve. So if we think about where would the equilibrium prices be, so this is, once again, they're selling out in both scenarios. So here's the old stadium equilibrium price for these tickets, and here's the new stadium's equilibrium price. So it kind of depends on whether or not we've just seen kind of a linear shift in demand, or whether or not demand has kind of changed its slope as well. So you could imagine, where's consumer surplus, right? So consumer surplus is always going to be kind of adding up across the quantities. So this is adding up across every quantity. The difference between the marginal benefit to consumers and their marginal cost, which is just the price they pay, right, for consumers. So another way of saying that, it's the area under the demand curve, but above the price they're paying. Okay. So with this new stadium, right, potentially I've kind of went from this being my old consumer surplus to new consumer surplus would be the area under the new demand curve, but above the price. So a lot of it's going to depend on whether or not it's just been a shift in demand or if we see any change in kind of the slope of demand, but potentially that new consumer surplus is less than before, right? Especially if I start to differentiate these maybe before where I didn't have several different types of tickets or several different types of seats. Well, now it's not just analyzing one ticket market. I'll have like 3 or 4. And so potentially whatever my consumer surplus was before, the new facility, I'm not going to have the same capacity of general seating, right? I've switched some of that capacity to luxury boxes. And so maybe, I lose a little bit in this market, but I gain it in the other. So it's really, no clear-cut answer for what's going to happen to consumer surplus, right? Even after we build these new facilities, consumers, we remember their marginal benefit has increased, the demand curve reflecting consumers' marginal benefits. So the marginal benefit has went up, but that doesn't necessarily mean surplus has increased. Okay. And this is just a little bit of a review thinking about consumer surplus here. And in fact, as long as we're doing this, where would producer surplus be just from the ticket market here? So producer surplus is going to be adding up across every single quantity sold. The difference between the marginal benefit to producers, which is the price they sell the ticket for, minus their marginal costs. So the price here is going to be kind of like the marginal benefit to producers. So really surplus is always just the difference between benefits and costs across every unit. It's just that for consumers, their cost is the price, whereas for producers, their benefit is the price. Right? That's what they receive when they sell the good. So we'll just kind of think about, I'll just do for the old stadium where producer surplus would be so we don't muddy this graph up too much. But really it's the area underneath price and what should be above the supply curve. But in the ticket market, notice my supply curve just runs along that x-axis up until I hit capacity. So I kind of end up with this producer surplus being this entire block down. And in the ticket market, because I don't have an increasing marginal cost and it's just running along the x-axis, notice what does producer surplus always equal in the ticket market? Well, notice here my equilibrium quantity would have been right at capacity. I had high enough demand in both scenarios. So this area of surplus is really just total revenue, price times quantity. Now that won't hold in every market because usually we have kind of increasing marginal cost, but in the ticket market where we have zero marginal cost up to capacity, my producer surplus is really synonymous with total revenue. Well, and I should say total revenue minus kind of total variable cost, but right, my variable costs are zero here. I have zero marginal cost. Okay. Any questions over anything there? I kind of threw a few things on the same graph, so okay with this. All right. So we've seen kind of I've already mentioned this, the size of stadiums have fallen in recent years, and so maybe we see this kind of lower capacity at the new stadium. So I won't waste too much time on this. It's kind of intuitive, and there's not much we can really do with the modeling, but we can at least think about why things have occurred the way they have, looking through history. So if we look at the past, when populations were smaller, right, it was hard to have high enough demand that translated to high enough revenues to justify like these huge new stadiums. So a lot of times you would see stadiums being shared across leagues. I believe I mentioned this Thursday a little bit, right? NFL, Major League Baseball teams, even as late as I think probably early 2000s, maybe was the last one, definitely in the 90s. You had a few teams sharing stadiums between the NFL and Major League Baseball. Right? The problem is, right, if we both share a stadium, neither can customize the stadium to best fit our field of play. Although, a football field and a baseball field are very different shapes, right? Excuse me, if you do have the book or you did buy it, there's like a little section in it and they go through and there's like pictures of a bunch of different shapes of stadiums. If we look at older stadiums, they tended to be like circular, right? Because you had kind of baseball and NFL games being played in the same stadium, instead of kind of having one that kind of was more of an oval and fit a football stadium better, or instead of having one that was just kind of the cutout of the baseball, they just tend to make it more circular, right? So that it was kind of a compromise between the two. Now, the problem is it was not optimal for either team, right? For a baseball stadium, you would probably want to line the seats up around kind of the, I guess you would call it what, an ice cream cone kind of shaped playing field, as opposed to in the NFL, you would want to do more of an oval, so you have more of your seats closer kind of to the long rectangular stadium. So because the shape of the field of play is different, the benefits to different shapes of the stadium will be different to both teams. Okay? So when they were sharing teams, yeah, they were cutting costs, but they were also foregoing some additional revenue by having a stadium that better fit their field of play. Right? And so over time, as demand increases, well, now as demand gets higher and higher, the amount of revenue I'm foregoing by not having an optimally shaped stadium, I'm giving up more and more revenue every year as populations grow. And so eventually over time, when we saw populations get to a certain level in these cities, we kind of see Major League Baseball start to build kind of more of these, I say cookie cutter, I don't know what, they're kind of all shaped different, right? Shaped to kind of fit the cone of the stadium, but then they have some amenities. They're just trying to get their seats to basically optimize the viewing benefits to all the people attending the game. And then I kind of mentioned NFL starts to kind of make theirs more of an oval to kind of fit their rectangular field of play, right? But it was only when demand got high enough such that the foregone revenues of having an optimally shaped stadium. So this is the idea that, right, as demand went up, the foregone revenues, or these opportunity costs, my opportunity cost just kept getting higher and higher. Remember, we talked about kind of economic profits, right? We're thinking about, we'll take our kind of revenues. We've got explicit costs. So this is things like, I don't know, the cost of the concrete to build the stadium, all these other things. But you also have kind of these implicit costs. So in implicit costs are what we generally refer to as these opportunity costs. So this is what I'm foregoing. So when demand got high enough, the amount of revenues that were being foregone by not having an optimally shaped stadium just kept getting higher and higher. And at some point, if these get high enough, what's going to happen is my economic profits would become negative, in which case it would actually make sense for me to build that stadium, right? So that I wouldn't have these opportunity costs, right? Build a more optimally shaped stadium. So it's really about kind of that ratio of my explicit costs, like the brick and mortar costs of building the stadium, versus what revenue am I foregoing by not building this optimally shaped stadium. We always want to be thinking about kind of economic profits, and here that the opportunity cost eventually, as populations got high enough, became too large for teams to ignore. Okay. Any questions on that? Is that clear? Okay with that. So, So we kind of, as that happened, we saw these teams start to build their own stadiums, right? Or at least, right, stadiums that fit their sport. We still see teams sharing stadiums, but they share within the same city and they're within the same sport. Now, with NBA and NHL, there's still quite a few. I don't know off the top of my head. I'd probably do a Google search maybe and figure this out. But right, a lot of them still share a stadium. So why would that be? Well, they have very, very similar size and shaped stadiums. Or sorry, it's not stadiums, fields of play, right? So they need similar stadiums to maximize the viewing benefits. So for them, there's really no opportunity costs in terms of they're not foregoing any revenues by sharing that stadium, right? Because their interests, right, align with that other sport in terms of having a stadium that fits their field of play. They have very similar fields of play. So, I would imagine, none of them are probably big enough yet. I wonder if I'm not as well versed in like US soccer, but I would imagine like if you could find, if soccer got big enough in the US, you could potentially see soccer and football teams sharing a stadium, right? Very similar sizes, fields of play. They would need very similar shaped stadiums. And so potentially they wouldn't really have any opportunity costs at the either. I mean, every WNBA and NBA team share a stadium, right? It's the exact same court. It doesn't make any sense to build a different facility. Okay. Is that clear? Any questions kind of related to that? So basically, think about it. When we have the exact same size stadium or same shape of stadium, I keep saying stadium, exact same size or shape field of play, right, then there really are no opportunity costs, right? And so then population changes really didn't affect these teams' decisions. So we've seen NBA and NHL teams share stadiums kind of similarly across history. And it's because that growing population didn't really impact those opportunity costs. So I think I might have went over this a little bit. But if we know that ticket revenue is a component of just total revenue, right? And we think that building these new facilities are going to increase the demand curve in that ticket revenue. So whether or not it's from an increased number of tickets sold or an increased price, we think that total revenue should go up in that ticket market, which would in turn increase the total revenue, right, overall. And it's just because it's a component of total revenue. So let's think about, I think I did this last class, but just to make sure. So we've got our wins market, right? Thinking about the product being wins, and kind of there's kind of dollar amounts attached to this. And so we can kind of put that on our y-axis. We'll kind of keep it simple with this constant marginal cost. And just to make this easy, all right, let's just assume that these teams are win maximizing. Okay? So the demand curve, right, from my old stadium, if I'm choosing the optimal number of wins, well, win maximizing, I'd be right here. Now, without revenue sharing, we said that demand is the same as average total revenue, which is why this is the point where profits were equal to zero. If we had a constant marginal cost, then the point where marginal cost hit average total revenue, we said profits would be equal to zero there. And you kind of, you can go through this again, but right, if I think about total revenue minus total cost, this represents profits. Well, I can just do kind of the averages here. So you can think about when our average profits equal to zero, if I just divide everything by the number of wins, well, this would represent average total revenue. My total cost was, if I have constant marginal cost, this guy here would just be marginal cost times number of wins divided by the number of wins. And so that's why when these two are equal, that's when I kind of have average profits of zero, right? And so that's why that point is where profits are equal to zero. I wouldn't like make you reproduce this, but I'm just giving some justification, kind of reminding us why. So if a new stadium increases demand to attend that game, we should see an increase in revenues, right? And so my average total revenue from this new stadium should be higher, even if it's only impacting gate revenue or a ticket revenue. Now, it might be impacting other things. I might be able to charge more when I sell my broadcast rights now because the stadium looks a little bit nicer, right? Or it's just more appealing to watch it on I have, set up more cameras in the stadium so that it's a much more, enjoyable kind of TV experience as well. Whatever it is, but even if it's only ticket revenue, we would see an increase in this demand curve. Now the point where my demand curve hits marginal cost is going to be way out here. Potentially, we won't just see an increase in attendance. Maybe we see an increase in the quality of teams after they build a new stadium. And this would be pretty easy to do, right? You could do like just go out and grab a bunch of win data or win percentage probably data. And then you would just have an indicator for whether or not it was in the year after they built a new stadium. And you could do not just 1 year, maybe you do, was it, in one of the 5 years after building the new stadium, right? And kind of see, is there an impact on team quality from building this new facility as well? Or maybe it's negative, right? Maybe they spent so much money on the new facility, maybe they spend less on player salaries and we see a decrease in quality. It's hard, there is a budget constraint floating around in the background here that we're not necessarily ignoring, but right, if I'm spending more money on the facility, that money has to come from somewhere. Okay. I don't know why this is a little bit. There we go. Okay. Any questions on that before we keep moving? Yeah.
So the salary cap was implemented.
Mm-hmm.
Would it even be worth like building a new stadium?
Let's think through it. So here's our original demand curve, right? So let's say we're win maximizing and the league said, maybe this is the best team in the league. And the league's like, we need to improve competitive balance. We need to kind of reduce this team's targeted number of wins. So maybe we institute a salary max, right, for the team, right? Not for individual players, but for the team. Okay? So that's going to force us down to this, so we'll call this win max, right? If we have a salary maximum. So now if I build that new stadium, what's going to happen to the targeted number of wins here? They're still going to hit that targeted, or they're still going to hit that salary max. So they'll actually stay at the same point if the salary maximum was there before they decided to build the new stadium. Now, the interesting kind of thing to think about though is even though they're targeting that lower number of wins, and this is, we don't necessarily calculate profits from this graph. There's a way we could do it. I'm not going to push us that far. Where I know that at any wins below this, right, profits are going to be higher than zero, right? Because here, I could draw my marginal revenue curves and think about where was profit maximized. And as I'm moving closer to that profit maximizing point, profits have to be going up. But notice here, I've got the same number of wins. And kind of, if you want to think about what the y-axis is really telling you, it's like the value of each win here. Well, notice if I build a new facility, even if there is a salary maximum, what's happened to the dollar per win? What's much, much higher, right? So even if there is a salary maximum, yeah, I might not see the quality of teams increase, but there's still an incentive for them to build that new stadium if they believe the demand will increase there in the ticket market. It's a really good question. Any other questions on this? Now, what if this was a salary minimum? No effect, right? I mean, you tell me I can't spend any less than this, and I'm targeting number of wins that is at higher cost. Well, okay, right? I'm already spending more than that, so it's not binding, we would say, or not effective. Okay. Question. So we could even complicate this a little bit further. So I said that there might be this honeymoon effect, right? So it might be that I've got some revenue function, and we could just think about ticket revenue for right now and the effect of a new facility on ticket revenue. We've got this function of revenue, which we know is increasing as the number of wins a team gets goes up, right? The higher the quality team, higher revenue they can generate. We also know that the age of the stadium is likely negatively related, right? Now we could get into some I'll throw a caveat into that in a second, but think about, relatively new stadiums once they're built, the amount of additional revenue they can generate is decreasing as that stadium gets older. Right? If I built a new stadium 5 years ago, that may not increase revenues as much as if I only built it 2 years ago. Right? It's a newer stadium. So we've got this revenue function. We also know that we're going to pay this huge fixed cost for the stadium. We'll call this C subscript 0. So we could write, right, that the revenue minus our costs, and here is kind of the cost associated with additional wins. Right? So this is just the cost associated with our wins. Right? And then here's that huge cost we paid for the new stadium. So it must be, right, that once I build this new stadium, that the additional revenues that we'll be generating, right, that whatever that profit amount is, the difference between revenues and costs, this difference must be greater than that huge fixed cost, right? We want to think about the reasons why here. So if we've got, and now I won't write them as functions for a second. So revenues minus costs, this represents kind of my profits. And really, if you want to, total revenues, total costs are what we're talking about here, not marginal, right? We're talking about the totals. And then we said, and we usually think about this as profit. However, I now have this difference, but I also have some costs that are independent of the number of wins, which we called C subscript 0. Right? So in order for this to be positive, for profits to be greater than 0 here, what we're really saying is, so you kind of think about total revenue minus total costs, minus these fixed costs are greater than 0. If I move this to the other side, it has to be that the difference between my total revenue and total costs are greater than, I'm just adding my fixed cost to each side, greater than those huge fixed costs of building the stadium, right? The additional profit I can make from building this new stadium has to be greater than the additional costs. Questions there? Okay. So you can think about potentially, if we don't believe that the change in revenue or change in cost is impacted at all by the age of the stadium, then it's really just, we can kind of think about it's just going to be the difference. Right? We could almost like get rid of this age from part of my revenue here. And so then it should be that we think about we're going to have this additional revenue year after year. However, because as age goes up of that stadium, we think that the additional revenues go down, my profits will be decreasing over time. And so I can't simply just take that difference and add it up over the next 50 years, because that difference will be declining year after year after year. So if the function of revenue is not, right, one of the components that impacts it is not age, well, then it's the same difference year after year. But if there is interaction between kind of the number of wins and age there, we would expect to see that kind of additional profits generated from having a new stadium decline the further away we are from when that new stadium was built, or the older the age of the stadium. Okay. So there's some work that's been done out there. So Hartson Clapp basically found that there was no difference in win quality. Right? So the targeted number of wins, I told you, I drew a graph for how we could potentially see an increase, but they found there was actually no additional kind of revenue generated. It wasn't necessarily that they weren't, sorry, I said that a little bit incorrectly. It's not that they weren't necessarily not winning a higher number of games, but that the revenue generated per game wasn't changing. Okay? For new versus an old stadium. The other paper found no difference at all in wins, so they weren't even looking at revenue. They found that there's no difference in kind of the targeted number. Well, shouldn't say that they found no difference in the targeted number of wins. That's kind of, we can't really observe that, but there was no difference in the realized number of wins. Right? So we've got some support that maybe, right, we aren't seeing these huge benefits to building a new facility, right, to really warrant these large fixed costs. Right? Or at least the evidence points to that. Like I said, these are kind of older papers. I haven't seen anyone do anything real new with this. It would be interesting to somehow exploit the fact that like SoFi and some of these other new stadiums that were built right before lockdowns, it would be interesting to kind of use them as a way to see like, what really happened after they built this new stadium. Did they see, we kind of have this year in which they couldn't fill it out to capacity, right? So there might be a way to exploit that. But I haven't seen anybody do anything with like newer data, which would be interesting to see. All right. Any questions before we keep moving here? I thought I had, did I skip over something here? Maybe I just put them in different orders. Oh, I did. Okay. How much time we have? I think we'll just do externalities. So they build these new stadiums, right? What might be some other benefits, right? They could benefit the consumers, the people that go to the game. Maybe it benefits the teams. They can increase revenues, increase profits. But potentially it has benefits to people that don't even attend the game or who aren't the team that built the stadium, right? So why might we think of stadiums to be considered a public good? So public goods are these goods that, it's hard to get any one person to build them. Like no one person is going to fund national defense, right? But once we have national defense, it benefits all of us, right? Once that national defense exists, like you benefit from it being there, I benefit from that, and me benefiting doesn't detract from you benefiting, right? So we call these public goods non-excludable and non-rival. So non-excludable is the idea that once it's out there, once it's produced, you can't prevent anybody from benefiting from it, right? Once national defense is paid for, they can't prevent me from enjoying the benefits of that, right? Or once the interstate is built, you can't prevent me from enjoying the benefits of that. Right? We also think of public goods as non-rival in that if I use the good, it doesn't detract from your benefit, right? Me enjoying the benefits of national defense doesn't detract from any of your benefits of having national defense either. Okay? So we would think about how might a stadium be non-excludable and non-rival? Not to the people maybe attending the game, but there's benefits to having a stadium in my area potentially. If I'm a restaurant owner, I probably like it if there's a stadium a block or two away, right? Excuse me. It probably brings in a lot of additional foot traffic, which increases my customers, potentially increasing my revenue, right, or my profits. So it's non-excludable, and once it's built, the restaurants get to enjoy the fact that it's in their neighborhood, right? It's non-rival in the sense that if I'm a restaurant enjoying it, well, the restaurant down the street can enjoy that as well. Now, maybe you could argue there it's a little bit rival in the sense that if we didn't have enough people in the city, right? Like we don't have enough people to fill both restaurants. I guess there it's rival, but we're assuming that there's more than enough people to kind of fill these restaurants, these bars, the stores kind of surrounding the area. Okay, so in that sense, we think about it as a public good. Tickets are not a public good, right? Because they are excludable. You cannot sit in the stadium, watch the game unless you pay for the ticket, right? So it is excludable and it's rival. Once you have the ticket, no one else can sit in that seat with you, right? Unless you have like a small child or something that they allow you to have, right? So tickets are definitely rival goods, and so they wouldn't be we're thinking about the stadium is the public good to the surrounding area or to the city, okay? So another thing we can think about, maybe it's not like restaurants and bars, but maybe it's just people like living in Wrigleyville enjoy just some value of a team pride or like feeling as though like this is their team, like, and it's hard to quantify that, right? But there is some value there that is non-excludable and non-rival, right? To like maybe some value to the people in the area to feel like this is their team. Right? Excuse me. So I would argue, I don't think this is like, this might seem a little hokey, but I don't think you can argue that like, if you ever meet someone from Boston, like they have value in every single Boston team, right? They will tell you all about how great they are. So they must be getting some value out of this, and they didn't pay to build the stadium, not necessarily. We'll talk a little bit about indirectly they likely did, but it's not like they're paying to build this new stadium. Even small town sports, it's like I'll give you an analogy. I know some people that live around Marion, and they have Indiana Wesleyan University up there. And there are old people who will go to all of their basketball games and are like proud that they have this like small college town basketball team that they can go watch. It's a little bit odd, right? That's bringing them value that they didn't have to pay for that, right? So we kind of already talked about, there's also potentially economic gains, right? Boosts in restaurants or nearby stores, right? The sales that we see from them, okay? So with a public good, we need to do a little bit of a review of externalities, okay? So first, we'll start with some negative externalities. So I've mentioned a lot of good things, right? A public good, a lot of positive externalities, but potentially these stadiums have negative externalities as well. What might be one major negative externality to the people living in the nearby area of a stadium? Traffic, right? I mean, even if you don't look at a professional level, like if you ever go to like a college game, trying to get out of some of those college towns is an absolute nightmare after a game, right? And so if I'm someone just living there and I don't attend the games, I'm not going to be very happy about the traffic, right? So there are some negative externalities that potentially exist. I'll tell you, even Muncie, I live close enough to Muncie high schools where their games are a negative externality to me because I have to hear the guy over the loudspeaker every time I have like a football game on Friday night. So there are these negative externalities we can think that might exist. So those are going to be costs to people who aren't involved in the market, people who aren't attending the game, people who don't own the team or the stadium, right? Like I mentioned, these are kind of people who live in the area. They're not participating in the market for those tickets. They may still have a negative externality, okay? Or an additional kind of cost. Okay? So usually, a general example outside of sports, we think about like nuclear waste kind of as a negative externality. I already mentioned the new stadium. Usually think about this as like traffic, or kind of maybe it brings in some not so sober individuals into my area. And so what's this going to look like? So I left this kind of blank. All right, we'll do a little bit of a review here. So, and I think that I had this set up in the slides. We can think about this as like the number of games being played, right? And so here's demand, here's supply. So this is the additional cost that come from playing a game. Here's the additional benefits to consumers from playing these games. So before we think about externalities, the equilibrium number of games, we'll kind of call this, we'll just call this Q star and P star here, would be here. Now, it's not necessarily like any one consumer is getting paid or is paying this particular price for these number of games, but when you think about, there's like a dollar amount associated with these games being played. Okay. So if we have a negative externality, it's essentially like we have these additional costs to society. So really, supply represents our private marginal costs, or the marginal costs of the people involved in the market. If we want our marginal social cost, right? So I'll call this MSC, our marginal social cost. That's going to be the marginal cost that exists to the producers that are involved in the market, but also these additional external costs to people outside the market. These external costs are the dollar measure of, our negative externalities, okay? So it's almost like a what? So if I have this additional cost, what's another type of additional cost that you have to pay if you go, buy anything? Sales tax, right? External costs or negative externalities work exactly like taxes, right? They're just this additional cost. And so when I'm thinking about at every given number of games, I'm going to have the producer's cost plus some additional amount. So you kind of think about it as at every given quantity, total costs to society are going to be higher. Or I get kind of this decrease in my supply curve. Same kind of thing that a tax would do. Increases the costs at every quantity. Okay. So for society, they would find it optimal if the equilibrium was, we'll call this S for society. So they would like there to be if there's these additional costs of the games being played, then their optimal number of games would actually be a little bit lower, right? And I say a little bit, it could be quite a bit lower depending on how large the externality is, right? If I had a large enough externality, what would it be optimal for society to do? So if a large externality, what's going to happen if this negative externality kind of keeps increasing? So if I get it to be all the way up here, right? If my marginal social cost was all the way up here, where does that hit demand? Well, they don't even hit each other. So actually there, you would end up with 0 games being played. Yeah. The higher shift. Well, here let's think about deadweight loss in this scenario is actually going to be the market equilibrium relative to society, right? So there's such huge costs here that if we saw this large of a shift from allowing the market to operate, ignoring the additional cost, the negative externalities, then really you're thinking about for every quantity, you have this huge additional cost that's going to like wipe out any surplus, right? So yeah, you would really just have an enormous deadweight loss, right? If you allowed the market to just operate freely, right? Now, if we choose the socially optimal point, really the surplus here should be just 0, right? It should be that there are no games being played. So by allowing the market to operate freely, what we're actually doing is for society, we'd end up with negative surplus, this huge deadweight loss, right? The optimal point would be 0. So many, with all this additional, any games played past that point, we really would just be kind of creating negative surplus overall. I think it's a little bit harder to think about. I'm not sure I want to do it. I think I will try though for you. So let's do just the original shift, right? So what would deadweight loss be? Well, here you can think about would be my consumer surplus if I allow the market to operate freely. Here would be I might have said that was consumer surplus, sorry. Here's my consumer surplus. So, well, then why is it a problem if I let the market operate freely? Like, look at all this surplus generated. However, right, there's also, you're going to think about for every quantity, the difference between my marginal social costs and my supply curve, that represents kind of the additional cost of society. So it's like, here's this additional cost of society. It's kind of wiped out by, this additional surplus. However, this little triangle here would be additional costs that weren't compensated for with surplus. So this triangle here would really represent my deadweight loss, because all of this surplus would exist if I chose a socially optimal point. So let me maybe try to do this a little bit different. So let's say we're operating off of society's optimal point, right? So we're taking into consideration these additional costs. We choose this quantity. I think about the price being here. So here would be consumer surplus, here's producer. Basically, the area in between my demand curve and my social costs is what should maximize surplus for society. By allowing the market to operate freely and ignore these social costs, right? They're just making decisions off of their own costs. They choose a higher quantity. So this higher quantity, you can kind of think about here now the difference between demand and the supply curve, the private supply curve. Well, here was all this additional surplus gain, right? This kind of green area we had shaded before. However, the difference between my social cost and my private marginal cost, here's also additional costs. So they just wipe each other out. And then once I get to up here, notice anywhere where I don't kind of have overlap in that shaded green area, in the black area, that represents losses that weren't compensated for by additional surplus. So that's why my deadweight loss kind of ends up being that upper triangle there. So it's a little bit different than a lot of the other kind of markets that we looked at and the other deadweight loss that we've thought about. Yeah, and as I get a higher shift, this would just like this triangle would be like this, right? Like it's a really gigantic deadweight loss triangle. Any questions over anything there before we kind of keep? So if we let the market operate freely, we end up at a quantity that is too high or higher than what society would find optimal. Okay. So that is, I believe, kind of this last, right? Too many games are played, right? We have a quantity of games being played that's too high, right? What about positive externalities? So, these will be benefits to people who aren't involved in the market. So usually I kind of think about education, like you pay for your degree, the college, pays all these costs to like provide you with this education. But there's a benefit to society, people outside the university, of you being more educated, right? And so some other examples in sport, right? We kind of already thought about the businesses in the surrounding area of this new stadium. Maybe it increases, creates additional jobs, increases the overall income level in the city. Oops. So what is this? Well, so we already got a kind of spoiler, but it's basically the opposite of a negative externality. Whenever we have a positive externality, we get too few games played. Right? So if there's like these huge benefits to society or to the area surrounding a stadium, I think about the quantity or the number of games here. Here's my demand curve, which represents marginal benefits. Here's my supply curve representing marginal cost. If the market operates freely, they'll kind of arrive at this equilibrium price and quantity. I'll move this in a second, actually. There we go. So if I have these additional benefits, well, now my marginal social benefit will be whatever the benefits are to the people in the market, plus the benefits that exist to people outside the market, which this is what represents my positive externality. So now at every single number of games being played, the benefits are whatever they would be before, plus some additional amount. Whatever they were before, plus some additional amount. And what they were before was really where I was at in my demand curve, because that reflected private marginal benefits. So then I'd have my marginal social benefits kind of shifting to the right, or you can kind of think about it, it'd be higher than my original private marginal benefits. And society, where their benefits are, hit their costs. And also, why did no one call me out on this? I was going to say, I think I was just talking, I wasn't paying attention to what I was doing. This is the old equilibrium price, and this is the equilibrium quantity. So now for society, they would actually find the optimal quantity to be a little bit higher, and then kind of that price to be higher as well. But really, mainly here, we kind of are focusing on this direction of the quantity. Right? So with positive externalities, too few games would be played. Questions here? And I would, one way I would think about these positive externalities as well is maybe not some like these huge existing teams. In fact, I think a lot of where you could see the positive externality story really playing out, like I don't think in Boston or New York, like there's really too few games being played, right? Or if that team wasn't there, it might just be another team that was located there, right? So it may not be that those are the cities you want to think about. But if you want to think about like maybe smaller or kind of like mid-range large cities, so maybe this is places like, I don't know, Fort Wayne in Indiana, or even South Bend, there's no way they can support a professional league, right? But what you could argue is they could benefit from having maybe minor league teams, right? And it may not be, where are those externalities going to come from? Well, the surrounding areas. So if you can build these minor league stadiums in an area of town that maybe was struggling and kind of help improve kind of the local establishments or businesses around that surrounding area, maybe those are scenarios where we really think about there's positive externalities that exist to people not involved in that market, right? Because not near as many people are going to attend those minor league games as, you could argue that maybe for the major league games, right, there's huge, a lot of, across the season or across 5 years, there's going to be a lot of different people who are attending games in and out. And so how do we differentiate between the consumers in that market and the people getting these external benefits? So it's, but I think with these smaller ones, you really get a nice cleaner idea of, well, yeah, not everybody in, Fort Wayne is attending minor league baseball games, but a lot of the businesses and things would benefit from having that in that area. Okay. Any questions on the idea of positive externalities before we keep moving? All right, so, and this is an old, I should have got this out of the slides. I didn't realize I left it in there. And I might do a question like this to kind of start next class. So I think I might skip ahead. So yeah, we'll pick up on this next class, but I do want to kind of just go through some of the existing literature and take a look at a paper here before we stop. So we'll kind of come back. So when we think about the impact, right, are there actual positive externalities to these cities? Like, do the local restaurants or does their surrounding areas see economic improvements? So there's been a lot of studies that find that there's really no effect of new stadiums or a stadium relocation on income in the surrounding area or unemployment rates in the surrounding area. However, right, there was a more recent paper, although still at this point almost 10 years old, that said, well, maybe we shouldn't be thinking about these large cities as really the ones that we want to look at, because if a baseball stadium or a football stadium doesn't exist in Chicago, that space is likely filled with something else, maybe a concert venue, maybe a museum, or something else that would be generating additional income and revenue for the surrounding kind of establishments, right? So maybe we want to look at cities where, yeah, if the stadium wasn't there, no one else is really going to be going to that. It's like no one, I shouldn't say this because I don't really know, but no art museum is trying to kind of choose Fort Wayne over Chicago, right? So you're not going to see like, well, Fort Wayne doesn't have a minor league baseball team, they're going to have this wonderful art museum in its place. Probably not, right? So this study focused on minor league baseball teams and the cities that they locate in. And there, instead of finding no effect, actually found a pretty positive effect on local per capita income. And if I remember right, I guess I didn't have it in here. I think if I recall the paper correctly, there was also slight improvements in unemployment, which actually means that unemployment went down, right? So there is some evidence that, yeah, if you're in a city where that team, that stadium wouldn't be replaced with something else, well, then we see huge, or not, I shouldn't say huge, I'm sounding like Donald Trump. Then we see like larger positive effects, as opposed to maybe some of these larger cities where if they didn't have that stadium, something else would be there in its place. Okay. And then there was a more recent study that it was more like a case study, but they specifically looked at Columbus, Ohio, kind of found a positive effect, and they were using Ohio State's football stadium and the real estate market. So they found that home values actually were lower the further away that those homes were from the stadium. So that's like something I wouldn't necessarily have thought about as like a positive externality. But maybe it's not, I guess the way that Ball State's set up, it doesn't, the corollary is not there. But a lot of these like really big football programs, the way the stadiums are built, this might be an area that's pretty close to a lot of residential housing, or even if they're student rentals, right? What's an additional benefit? So I'll tell a little bit of a personal anecdote. So my brother went to grad school at Oklahoma, and I went and visited him a couple of times, and every Saturday he would basically rent out his yard for parking and make $200-300 every weekend off of just having people pull into his yard. I don't know if his landlord knew that, but right there, that's an additional benefit, right? Like the home. And so they were looking at home value, but I mean, the home value goes up because they know that, if I am using it as an Airbnb, people are going to be more likely to pay more to be closer to the stadium. I am going to be able to do things with that property, like potentially students who might want to be close to there on game day might be willing to pay a little bit higher of rent. So there's a lot of like benefits a lot of people haven't really tried to uncover. I think this was a pretty interesting case study, but especially now with like Zillow, you could probably get at some pretty interesting like average home price data for different geolocations and try to do something like this and see, well, maybe even do we see rental rates change? And the rental rates, that's a positive externality to whoever's renting that place out. Right? So I think it's interesting to think, not just, maybe the conventional ways, think about boosting the income of surrounding restaurants and bars, but, maybe there's some things like in the real estate market, or maybe there's, something like other businesses and services in the surrounding area. I'm sure tow truck companies probably get a nice positive externality from having a stadium located nearby. Okay. All right. So then the other thing I wanted to go through before we got through this is, and we'll talk more about this on Thursday, which is how are these stadiums paid for? But long story short, basically through taxes, right? So the city, Seattle will increase taxes. People who live in the city will pay them. They then use these taxes to help subsidize the building of these stadiums, right? So, and we'll talk about a little bit why that makes sense in terms of a positive externality, why we might see subsidies. But basically what they did before, they didn't just like arbitrarily raise taxes, they put out a referendum and had the city vote whether or not they wanted to build a new stadium in the proposed location, okay? So, taxes were going to be on tickets, parking, tourist taxes, hotel rooms, and they had like some weird thing going on with like lottery tax funds were going to be rediverted to education. So they were like typical politics, like rolling multiple things into one. But really the main thing of this referendum was whether or not, they wanted to kind of increase these taxes to help pay for this new stadium. Right? So what's really interesting, this is a small paper that kind of looked at this, and they broke up these into like little districts within this county. And I think it's here you can see, here's where they wanted to build the new stadium, this star right here. Right? So higher shades of black here represent that more people were in favor of increasing these taxes to help pay for the stadium. So what's kind of interesting to note here, and this is some body of, I don't know what this is, what's the, out in Washington, whatever body of water this is in Washington. But notice, as I get to counties, or not counties, like districts that are further away from that stadium, the people that were most likely or had the highest proportion of voting to increase these taxes were people that were very far from the stadium, right? Even on the other side. So they're not going to have to worry about paying these additional hotel tax. They're not going to have to worry about paying the additional, sales tax in the surrounding area of the stadium. And so the people that are kind of closer nearby might be impacted more by things like traffic, even just people who are on the same side of this body of water. That's where we saw people way less likely to vote for that. Everyone who is way more likely very far from the stadium probably experience none of the externalities, negative externalities that might exist, but still get the positive externalities of, well, even if I'm kind of far from the stadium, if it brings people in, they might travel out, they might travel out a ways, or they might try to stay a little bit further away. And so I still can enjoy some of the positive externalities, even if it's not, all of them, right? If I'm not right next to the stadium, but I can avoid all of the negative externalities. So this is kind of an interesting, little case study to think about really how do the citizens also view the costs and benefits of having this stadium in their surrounding area. Okay. And notice here, people that were just a little bit away from the stadium, very unlikely to vote for it. But people really close to the stadium, yeah, that's where negative externalities would be at its highest, right? The traffic would be the worst. But these would also be districts where the positive externalities to the local restaurants and bars would be also at their highest. All right, so it's kind of interesting to kind of look at this map and kind of think about how the costs and benefits to the citizens in this area would kind of vary. And we see their voting behaviors really reflected that. Okay. And they did this nice little thing here. So I wanted to write out, so I thought this was kind of an interesting thing. So we've got something that we haven't looked at yet, and I think I'll try to get the reading I put up. I'll make sure it has something with an interaction term. So what they were trying to do is see their Y variable, or their dependent variable, was just the proportion of people who voted yes on this referendum. Each observation was one of these little districts. So the Y variable they were interested in was, well, what's the proportion of people who voted yes on this referendum to build this new stadium? And I then thought about, okay, I've got some intercept, and I've got distance. Right? But it may be that, so we got distance, and this is 10 miles, 20 miles, 30 miles. So we kind of noticed here, there's straight lines, to points, almost I plotted some points here. So instead of just including distance, the problem with if you just would include distance here is that this would be a completely linear effect. So whenever we've been having an X and a Y variable, what we're really thinking about is we've got all this data, and all we can come up with is this line of best fit, and it's going to be linear. Right? But maybe the data looks something like this. Right? And there's some curve to it. Right? So one thing you can do is do something include a quadratic. But if you want to make sure that it doesn't have a specific functional form, maybe it's here and then maybe it jumps or something like that, what you can do is break this down into a bunch of different categories. Right? So what you can do is say, okay, instead, I'm going to do an indicator for, is it between 0 and 10 miles, right? Or not, it's probably not in miles, whatever the distance was they used. I doubt it was miles. It was probably something like, I don't know, city blocks or something. But so maybe we think about 0 to 10 city blocks away, right? And this was just a 1-0 variable. And then you include another one, which was, okay, was it between 10 and 20? And this is just a 1-0 variable. And you basically include all these indicators for being in different categories for distance away from the stadium, right? So then this coefficient tells you the additional increase in the proportion of people who voted yes, if it was a district that was 0 to 10, whatever it was, city blocks away. And then this is the change in the proportion of people who would vote yes if you were 10 to 20 blocks away, so on and so forth, okay? So what that allows you to do is then, okay, here's the additional change for people who were 10 miles away. And then what you would do is kind of leave out a base group. So I think what they ended up doing here was they left out the 0 to 10 group. And so then it just, you would come up with whatever the predicted probability of voting yes was based off of all the other characteristics. And then here, you just start adding in those coefficients. So what if I'm 0 to 10 blocks away, 10 to 20, 20 to 30, or whatever it is. And it looks like here, maybe they broke it down in 5s instead of in 10s. But that allows you to kind of get this nice, non-linear effect here. So you can see that initially, getting further away from that stadium made it much more likely people were going to vote yes. So right, it must be that as you start to move further from the stadium, those negative externalities drop pretty quickly. And then as you get even further away, well, now the percent voting yes starts to go down more and more because, yeah, the negative externalities are gone, but the further I get from the stadium, the lower the positive externalities will be to me as well. So they kind of found this kind of non-linear relationship. They did the same thing, but they kind of made it a little bit more disaggregated, so it wasn't as kind of disjoint, and they found a similar effect, right? Initially, more likely you vote yes. At a certain point, you get far enough away where you're less likely to vote yes. It's kind of an interesting kind of case study that allows us to kind of think about how positive and negative externalities would vary relative to where you're at in terms of location of the stadium. Okay. So that online quiz I'll post as soon as I get back to my office. That'll be due before we start class Thursday. Also, I'll post an announcement on Canvas. My office hours won't be the same tomorrow. I'll likely add some office hours on Thursday. I need to figure out exactly what time. I've got some things I've got to run around and do tomorrow around the building. So I will get an announcement up about that as well. Okay, so if you're finishing up that homework, I will put a little bit of extra hours there on Thursday if you were planning on coming by tomorrow. Okay. All right. See you guys on Thursday.